Hello, welcome to this online presentation of Using Motivation 3.0 with Community Health Workers. I'm Tom Davis. I'm Senior Director of Program Quality Improvement with Food for the Hungry and also Senior Specialist for Social and Behavior Change with the TOPS Project. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a distinction here that sometimes gets lost when people hear about the ideas in Dan Pink's book, Drive. We will be looking at two questions. The first question is answered in detail in Pink's book, that is, under what conditions do performance-based incentives work and not work, and what are the dangers of using them indiscriminately? And second, should we pay community health workers or use volunteer community health workers, or both? This is not a question that Pink's book answers directly, but many of the findings in the book are applicable as we decide on what types of incentives, intrinsic and extrinsic, we have at our disposition and how we can use those. So rest assured that Dan Pink and I both see the value in paying people for the work that they do, but we need to carefully think through who to pay for what, realizing that there's a whole science behind incentives that we need to understand. And people are not as simple as they seem on the surface. And we cannot just give people what they say they want and expect it to all work out. And if you need proof of that, read Dan Gilbert's book, Stumbling into Happiness. But that's a book for a different day. So, we're first going to listen to an overview of the main findings of Dan Pink's book, Drive, which was published in 2009. This book has been called by some a paradigm-shattering look at what truly motivates us and how we can use that knowledge to work smarter and live better. So now you have an overview of some of the latest findings on motivation. Some of it's surprising, right? Well, let's talk about a few more. In the book, Pink mentions three basic human drives deduced from psychological experimentation that motivate animal and human behavior. And the first basic human drive is biological: hunger, thirst, and copulation. He calls that motivation 1.0. And if you're looking at this picture here and thinking, what is that guy thinking? Well, he's probably not thinking very much. Motivation 1.0 doesn't require a lot of that. In fact, some of those urges can be mapped way down in the brain near the amygdala and hippocampus, what some have called the reptilian brain. The second basic human drive is extrinsic reward. This is reward and punishment delivered by the environment for behaving in certain ways, which Pink refers to as motivation 2.0. This is what we all learned about in school, B.F. Skinner's work with rats pushing levers to get food. There are some useful lessons here, but humans are complex enough that we need to go deeper. The part of our brain, interestingly, that seems most active when dealing with these sorts of extrinsic rewards like money and cocaine is called the nucleus accumbens. It's above the amygdala and hippocampus, not quite down as deep. The third basic human drive is intrinsic reward. This is when the joy and satisfaction of completing a task motivates its completion. He calls this motivation 3.0. Dan Pink talks about some of the best examples. Wikipedia, with its 90,000 regular active contributors, all volunteers, is one example of a robust use of motivation 3.0. Care groups, which we'll talk a little bit about later, is another example of where you can mobilize lots of volunteers to get work done without using any of these extrinsic rewards. So in practice, the second most of motivation, think performance-based incentives, has been applied at human organizations for centuries, based on the idea that the best way to improve performance, increase productivity, and encourage excellence is to reward the good and punish the bad. And modern psychological experimentation and examination of human productivity has found that utilizing this sort of motivation is useful for unrelenting, routine, mechanical, or boring tasks. It's great for getting people to work long hours at a time, clean out latrines, poke kids in the arms with a vaccine for 8 hours a day. It's not good for everything, though. It's not as useful when creativity, maximization of performance, quality, and commitment are needed or desired. In fact, as the studies of MIT and Madurai, India showed in the video, once a task calls for even rudimentary cognitive skills, larger rewards can lead to poor performance. It's very counterintuitive, but it's true. So for that reason, I think it behooves us to tap into those intrinsic motivations, both for community health workers and for unpaid volunteer community health workers. We'll be talking more later about some examples of extensive use of volunteer community health workers and how that works. Using volunteer community health workers may not work everywhere, but I'll make the case that at least it has been shown to work in Cambodia, Mozambique, Malawi, Rwanda, Kenya, Liberia, and India. And actually on this online presentation, there's a separate link that will be available that you can see that presentation on care groups. Okay, so Pink outlines several problems with Motivation 2.0. Mainly problems with mainly relying on these carrots and sticks. One is they can extinguish motivation. Rewards can perform a strange alchemy. They can turn an interesting task into drudgery. This has been known for a long time. Mark Twain talked about how wealthy gentlemen in England took carriages on joyrides in the summer and really enjoyed it. But if you paid them to do that, it would become work and they would resign. Rewards per se are not the problem. It's contingent rewards that are the most problematic. If you do this, I'll give you that. They can diminish performance as well. We saw this second one in the video. Higher rewards led to diminished performance. Part of that is spending cognitive energy thinking about the reward when we could be focusing on creative ways to get the work done, but there are other reasons for that as well. When money and other extrinsic rewards come into play, we even use different parts of our brains to decide how to proceed with a task. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Carrots and sticks can also crush creativity. Have any of you heard of Dunker's? This is what that looked like. In Dunker's candle problem, participants are given these things: a box of tacks, a book of matches, and a candle. They're put on a table in a small room with wooden walls, and then the person is asked to attach the candle to the wall so that the wax doesn't drop onto the table. They randomize people into two groups, and people in the first group are told that they're being timed just to find out how long it typically takes someone to complete this sort of puzzle. But the second group is told that the fastest 25% of participants will receive $5, and if they're fastest of all, they'll get $20. Well, guess who loses? The group that is offered the performance-based incentive takes 3.5 minutes longer to solve this puzzle. The problem is that rewards narrow our focus when sometimes we really need to be thinking outside of the box. And in this case, the person literally needs to think outside the box. Here's the solution. You dump the tacks out of the box and use the box. You attach the box to the wall with the tacks and then put the candle on it. Now, this doesn't really require a high level of creativity. You don't need to be Picasso to figure this out. But the monetary incentive hindered people in completion of this task. The book Drive has even more examples of this phenomenon of how monetary incentives often make people hurt performance. There are 4 other major problems with Motivation 2.0, the carrots and sticks approach. Another is that they can crowd out good behavior. One example of this is a study from Sweden where they randomized people into groups and offered to pay one group $7 to donate blood. And the group that was offered the payment, fewer people showed up to donate. The reason? It's believed that it tainted an altruistic act and crowded out the intrinsic desire to do something good. Now, removing barriers to good behaviors is not the same thing. For example, the Italian government gave blood donors paid time off to donate blood, and donations increased. They basically said, we won't penalize you for taking time out of your day to donate. They can encourage cheating, shortcuts, and unethical behavior. There are more examples of that in the book, and you can look at the crash in 2008 to get some ideas about that one. They can also become addictive. By offering a reward, sometimes we signal to the people that the task is undesirable. As one researcher put it, rewards are addictive in that, once offered, a contingent reward makes an agent expect it whenever a similar task is faced. So, when we give a mother an incentive to come to the clinic for antenatal care, we're signaling that there's not a very good reason for her to do so other than the incentive. And when we stop giving that incentive for showing up for antenatal care, you can bet the likelihood of them doing it on their own is reduced. MRI imaging has shown that when you offer someone a chance to win cash, dopamine surges in a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And interestingly, this is the same mechanism of most addictive drugs. Pink points out in the book that promising people monetary rewards and giving them cocaine, nicotine, and amphetamines look disturbingly similar. Lastly, carrot and stick motivations can foster short-term thinking, and there are examples of that in the book. Now we need to remember that Motivation 2.0 is useful for some things. For example, tasks that are inherently unpleasant and tasks that only require mechanical skills. Good luck in trying to use Motivation 3.0 to get people to do those. For those, you're probably going to have to rely principally on Motivation 2.0, the carrot and stick sort of method, especially carrots, of course. And of course, we need to pay people a baseline wage when a volunteer cannot be expected to do a task or job. When can we expect a volunteer to do a task? We'll talk about that a bit later. But for community health workers, meeting their basic needs also includes the basic training, supplies, consumables, and supervision that are essential for completion of common and important tasks. Now let's talk about Motivation 3.0. To use Motivation 3.0, we need to give people autonomy. People work better when they're given an adequate degree of autonomy over the task, that is what they do, time, when they do it, team, who they do it with, and technique, how they do it. We need to think through how we can build this sort of autonomy into the roles of community health workers to use that motivation. Secondly, we must help people to achieve mastery. Mastery is becoming better at something that matters to you, something that you find important. Progress in one's work turns out to be the single most motivating aspect of many jobs. It's a capacity to see your abilities not as finite, but as infinitely improvable. This means that we may need to focus on participatory quality improvement with community health workers. We need to have ways that they can continuously improve their skills, learn new things, and ideally have a career ladder. But just being able to do something better and better each year, even without an increase in pay, is often enough for a lot of people. We also need to set high goals for quality performance, not quotas, which have their own problems, but goals for doing things in the right way and goals that community health workers can buy into. And then help people to progressively work towards those goals while helping them to keep some autonomy. We need to talk about those goals in meaningful ways as well. It's not them helping us to meet project targets. It's about them learning how to achieve excellence in what they do. We also need to help people to discover purpose in what they do. People, by their nature, seek to make a contribution, to be part of a greater cause and a more enduring one than themselves. We need to help community health workers connect with what is important to them, to see changes in their own lives, in their family, and in their communities. This is one reason we have volunteer community health workers count births and deaths in their communities, and to do household visits where they observe what's happening. We want them to see the results and impact for themselves, to be able to see a man who no longer beats his wife and say, I had something to do with that. To see a woman with a thriving child after she lost 3 in infancy and said, I was part of that. That's motivation. So what else do we need to keep in mind as we use these new findings on Motivation 3.0? These deeper motivations based on our desire for autonomy, mastery, and purpose? Well, we believe that volunteers can be called upon and counted on to do many things that community health workers do, just using intrinsic rewards. I suggest you look at caregroupinfo.org for some of the blogs there that talk about what volunteers have achieved. But to do that, there are some conditions, I would say. One is the workload needs to be kept light, less than about 8 hours a week. When asking whether a community health worker needs to be paid or given an extrinsic reward or not, the first question that we should think of is, what's the workload that we're expecting from them? And in my experience, if you're expecting more than about 8 hours a week, you probably need to think about some sort of payment or extrinsic reward. And I don't believe very much in this like $5, $7 a month sort of reward. If you're going to pay people, give them a lot to do and pay them a fair wage. And otherwise use volunteers with intrinsic rewards. The middle ground is the most dangerous one, I believe. It's like having a friend who asks you if you will take him to the airport and he'll give you $2. What would you say to someone like that? Probably something like, I'll take you as a friend, but offering me $2 to do that isn't near what it costs me, and it's a little bit insulting. A very small incentive has the dual disadvantage of not being enough to motivate the person to work while knocking out some of their internal motivations for doing the task. Volunteers are helpful also when mostly basic skills are needed, and those skills can be imparted slowly. Volunteers can master quite a bit over time, so I think the workload requirement is more important than the level of skill that you need. Volunteers can do a lot of things that community health workers regularly do if there's a focus on finding and using those intrinsic rewards, such as giving volunteers more autonomy in how they do things, providing pathways to mastery in what they do, helping them with quality improvement, and helping them to discover the purpose associated with their work through measurement, giving them feedback on what they're doing, and asking them, what are they getting out of this? So, do we need Motivation 3.0 for paid community health workers? Well, when a certain level of time, intensity, and skills are needed, or when the job that needs to be done is inherently dull or distasteful, some sort of regular compensation or other extrinsic motivation is usually required. But even when you're using paid community health workers in a system, that doesn't mean that we forget about Motivation 3.0. If we want to mobilize their commitment, creativity, and ownership, we need to mobilize their internal motivations as well, their intrinsic motivations. So yes, we need to use Motivation 3.0 as well with paid community health workers. We need to use these higher level motivations and go beyond offering only wages to community health workers. We need to help community health workers to have some autonomy in their work, achieve mastery, and discover purpose in what they do. To close, as I was reading about purpose and joyful work and doing things for the community, I was reminded of this quote by George Bernard Shaw, so I want to leave you with that. I think it encapsulates well the deeper motivations that really drive us the most. And my hope is that this community health worker in the picture, when she's 90 years old and she's drawing her dying breath one day, will be able to give this little speech. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community. And as long as I live it, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I behold up for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it over to future generations. Thank you. Force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community. And as long as I live it, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I have a hold up for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it over to future generations. Thank you.